and welcome to the next in our series of Nursing Reimagined. My name is Helen Aviard, and I'm Associate Professor here at Oxford Brookes University and Programme Lead for the Professional Doctorate in Nursing and Midwifery. Just a note as well to say that this session is being recorded. Those of you who've joined other in this series will know that this Nursing Reimagined series is a series in which we bring together two doctoral students whose work aligns in some way, and with them we tease out overriding messages and see where they converge and where they're different from their work. Doctoral study, like nursing generally, addresses topics that are challenging, and this one is no exception. Both of our speakers have addressed topics which shine a light on topics that really do need to be looked at. The focus of this session is slightly different. I'm very pleased to introduce Sally, who's going to be looking at nursing in leadership. And Elaine, although her project was looking at the future of nursing and the use of robots, together they are actually going to be looking at a paper that they wrote exploring their journey on the professional doctorate. So I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Sally Bassett. Thank you very much for coming. Dr. Elaine Strachan-Hall, thank you as well for coming. And my colleague, Dr. Kathleen Greenway, who is very kindly going to host our session today. Sally, might I hand over to you straight away?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm absolutely delighted to be here and, of course, having an opportunity to work with Elaine again. That's brilliant. So I'm going to start by saying a little bit about myself, and I'm going to, which leads into why I did the study. I'm going to tell you a bit about how I did it, what I found, and how I'm going about implementing the findings. So the doctorate for me came well into my senior career, and I was very keen, as it were, to think about how do I answer some of the curious questions that I've come across in the work that I've been doing. So the work that particularly led me to this was I was a director in PricewaterhouseCoopers, which is a professional services firm, and I had the privilege, benefit, and responsibility, I guess, of working on the Mid Staffordshire Review and then a number of other fairly high-profile challenged organisation investigations, such as Winterbourne View. Undertook the Keogh review, was part of the team that helped shape the initial CQC lines of inquiry. So that meant I'd spent a lot of time in boardrooms with often non-nurses, non-clinicians, and undertook that translation role of this is what I think is really happening here. And one of the questions that kept coming up for me is, I wonder why people are saying the things they are, or they're not saying those things. And that made me think about my previous experience of working at the Strategic Health Authority as the deputy chief nurse, where we would often have very senior nurses, executive nurses, come and spend time with us. If things hadn't gone quite as well as they could have done in their own organisations. And that also then made me think about the time that I'd spent as a chief nurse and as a director of nursing, although I don't have the length of experience, for example, that somebody like Elaine has had, but I had 3 or 4 years of experience of working in that world. And it really left me with that, I wonder why. And the wondering why is a really good starting point for any type of study. Anybody who's going to be undertaking any kind of research is going to have a kind of a wondering why. And what the professional doctorate offered me was an opportunity as a mature student, I guess, to explore that question. And I started out with a sense of I want to leave a legacy, so a sort of a personal ambition. So I came at this program with I wonder why, and obviously what the program allowed me to do was to work out how to answer that question through the various different taught sessions, and obviously moving into the research section. And one of the questions that or things you have to explore is that how am I going to answer that? How am I going to answer that question? And what this slide here is a kind of an overview of, which probably took about 3 years to get to this point of how I was going to go about actually answering this question. And I decided that it was more or as equally important to ask other people why they perceived executive nurses as successful as unsuccessful. So I framed my why question as what is it that's shaping success? So I also included chief executive officers, medical directors, and other senior nurses in my investigation, as well as executive nurses who were both currently in post as executive nurses and who those had also retired. Now, the executive nurse post came into being around about 1990. It surprisingly had very little evaluation from the Department of Health. It is a requirement for organisations to have an executive nurse, but no real work had been undertaken to think about the impact or evaluate the role. And one of the few pieces of guidance that existed for these roles was produced by the NHSI in 2019. Right, so it identifies what the role here is, both strategic and corporate, and the management of the trust. So that was my kind of founding piece of, if you like, starting point. But it really made me realise that there was very little underpinning evidence for this particular role. So that took me to thinking about, well, I want to do more than just explore and describe in detail what those experiences of those nurses are relating to I want to understand why they behaved or behaving in the way that they are, led me to choose critical realism. And a way of gathering that data and telling the stories was to adopt a narrative inquiry approach. And that enabled me to both ask what was the experience of working with or being an executive nurse, a chief nurse, and then to look for plausible explanations for why it might be happening in that way. And you can see that the results of that many hours of analysis and struggle to create that to create some findings, that I ended up with four narratives from each of those different different participant groups, which I then synthesized into an overarching narrative. And what I'm going to do on the next slide, if we could please, is just to share some of those findings with you. So please do read these. I'm obviously going to just say a little bit about it, but read them and see what emotion it evokes in you. So one of the things that obviously, because we have to focus very hard on being reflexive when we're doing this type of work. I was really surprised, although I'd been around in this world for a relatively long period of time, I was really surprised at some of the things that people shared, how honest they were, and just how challenging some of the things that I heard that I found. So, for example, there's one about class, whether we like it or not. Class affects the affects the workplace, the conflicts that the executive nurse had to overcome in order to be able to attain a space. The example there that there's a belief that nurses exaggerate what they need in terms of resources. And that's that's a direct quote there. It says, "Bloody nurses again. Here we go again. They're looking for more money." The example there from clinical, when we were talking about clinical, or somebody was talking about clinical governance, and they said, "Oh, well, that's just that nursey crap. Executive nurses just become a desk jockey." It's much easier to get rid of an executive nurse than it is a medic. We can easily throw the nurse overboard. And of course, from many of the investigations that I've been involved in, that's exactly what I had seen, with nurses being made a scapegoat, the executive nurses being made as a scapegoat. A couple of others just to pull out there. Sometimes the verbal I'm hesitating to use the word violent, but actually, if we think about violence in the sense of the anger and the mistrust that these nurses can be exposed to, the example there, that, there were actual tantrums. They banged on their table, and I really had to say no. So the courage that some of these nurses had to find. And the final one at the bottom there, just to draw your attention to, is, like it or lump it, there's a very strict hierarchy. Medical directors are above directors of nursing for the public, and to most people in their organisation. It's easy to ignore the executive nurse's advice. about what will keep the organisation safe. And I'm going to say a little bit more about why that might have been in not this slide, in the next slide. So in this slide, what I was able to do was to be able to describe the experience of the executive nurses moving into the first post, and what it might be that it would take them to be deemed and perceived as being successful. And I've captured that in this expression here of nursing not speaking for itself, in contrast to medicine. Medicine has a really high social value. So one of the things these executive nurses have to do is to individually demonstrate their credibility, whereas medical directors came with that level of credibility. And until they had gained that level of credibility, then their nursing advice didn't hold much traction or sway or persuasion with the executive board. And these were, in terms of chapters, actually came from one of the participants who described their experience as an executive nurse as being one in three chapters, and that was certainly something that was reflective in the other narratives. So you can see here, you have to first of all establish your place and find a way of establishing your credibility, and you have to do that without being perceived as being too nursey. Because if you're too nursey, which is crazy, right? Because that's what you're there for as a nurse. But if you come across as too nursey, too emotional, then you are not necessarily well perceived. You then move into a period of time where you are now confident about offering an opinion, and people will listen, because you've found a way of articulating what it is that you need to be able to say, or indeed you might not say so much about nursing now, and you're more viewed as a manager, as a director within the organisation. Those people who were successful in getting to chapter 3 managed to do both. They were able to hold this liminality between being this hybrid role of both being a nurse and a manager and leader within an organization. And if they didn't speak, silence meant something different now. If they weren't speaking, if they weren't saying something, that was seen as a signal to the rest of the board that actually their opinion needed to be sought. So they go from being quite silent at the beginning because they're trying to find a way of actually saying something, that they then will offer an opinion, and it can be heard and listened to. And their silence at the end, if they don't say something, is then perceived as actually this might be a trigger that the board needs to ask them a question. And this managing this liminality is different. If you look at the literature, often when you have a hybrid role, what you're seeking to do is to synthesize those two aspects of the role. What was different, or what I found in my study, was that those who had actually been perceived as successful managed to retain that liminality. They absolutely recognized their nursing identity. They were able to contribute and talk about nursing and to lead nursing, as well as being a very good corporate executive. And I'm arguing that that development space is one of the things that shapes the way in which they lead. Now, the other major finding for me was about the explanation of why it came about in the way that they did. And what I'm introducing to you here is the finding of the context that I've called nurseism, which again is about nursing not speaking for itself, but it's where we get these intersecting forces that actually shape unconsciously, for the most part, the prejudice and bias that people might hold towards that executive nurse. Remember, one of the things I said they have to do is to establish their personal credibility. Now, they may or may not be conscious of this nurseism, but they have actually found a way of contending with it and coping with it. If you look at my diagram there on the far left, what you can see is many prejudices and biases that you'll be familiar with. So the stereotype about nursing, the virtue script that we tend to lean into, the emotive stuff, which is the things the board really were uncomfortable with. The status of caring in society, the fact that we know that we have misogyny and sexism, that we have nursing position within society and most people's eyes around being a gender type of work. We have classism, though we tend not to talk about classism too much. And I'm going to talk a lot more in a moment about the new public management ideology, which I'm particularly hold a view that we actually don't talk about that in a very conscious kind of way. But where you get these forces converging, as I've said, consciously or unconsciously, you have culture within your board, which I have framed as nurses, which is a new way of articulating that knowledge. Now, the images in the middle are a way of articulating what's within those within that diagram. And you can see there that there's evidence that you will see this in the pay scale. So how we are, how our pay contrasts to the police force here. I was looking at literature just this week, and that nursing is positioned again within society as being a middle ranking and a junior professional, in contrast to lawyers, in contrast to our medics or board directors. You've got the harlot image. You have the deferential picture there, and obviously you've got the picture of the single female at the end of the board, not even engaging in the eye contact there that you've got with that board discussion. Why might that be? Well, what we saw which is where the executive nurse role came in, what we saw within the early 1990s with this social political shift to neoliberalism, where the government essentially, though we voted the government in, of course, so we as society agreed with this, that it would be better if we looked at the at the private sector as a means of managing the resources, as a means of managing the way that the public enterprise should be led and managed by the government. So what we have here is a shift now to thinking about, and our language has taken this on. We talk about productivity, we talk about accountability, we talk about governance, and what we've actually got is that finding its way into not only the nursing language, but nurses become a key tool by which this philosophy of how public management should take place, and that's known as new public management. And if you go to look that up, you'll find loads and loads of excuse me, literature written about it. How did I get to that particular finding? Well, I applied the theoretical frame of epistemic injustice, particularly written about by Fricker, who actually talks about the hidden knowledge, or the knowledge that people hold but may not be able to be conveyed because of who they are. And we might well recognize this now in the expression of institutional racism. And Fricker's work on epistemic injustice explains institutional racism. So our executive nurse, because of who they are not able to be influential. And you saw that in the liminality expression that I've just described to you. But for that particular theory to be proven, there also needs to be harm. And if you think about the damage that is done to individuals who are scapegoated, and we have a high proportion of our distressed organisations, you will see that the executive nurse is the one who leaves the organisation. Occasionally, the chief executive, predominantly the executive nurse. But the greater harm comes from their great harm also comes from the fact that their advice isn't listened to. And we can look at that, and when we think about safe staffing, we can think about evidence that isn't put into practice, and the negotiation that the executive nurse might be engaged in by having to talk about nursing in terms of a workforce commodity. They might be arguing they want 8 registered nurses for a particular area, but there's not sufficient money, and they're forced into trading to have 6 executive nurses and 4 healthcare assistants, for example. So we get the harm there by we actually don't have safe patient care. So that's the nurseism. I want to go on now to the next slide to say how has that summer come about in terms of leadership development? Well, as I said, in the early 90s, we moved away from thinking about that public consensus to looking to the business sector, leadership theory, and this diagram is trying to articulate to you that when we imported that into the NHS, and all of our NHS leadership policies written pretty much in the the light of and using the evidence from the private sector, which is really about increasing productivity, as I've said, what you see is there is a tension then with those nursing values. And if you look here, for those of you who are nurses, you'll recognize that as being part of our NMC code of conduct, where there's a real tension now about this drive for meeting social value through productivity, through actually meeting individual patient and society and population needs through the values that underpin nursing. That then leads into, again, this liminality, this role duality that these executive nurses actually have to contend with, because they're there to be a high-performing executive, leaning into the leadership expectations and the leadership management and their likely preparation. Quite a good number of executive nurses will have perhaps stopped studying nursing and thinking about nursing at a diploma level, at a degree level, potentially at master's level, but very few with doctorates. And so they've got this residual knowledge about nursing, a culture that is really expecting them to perform highly as a corporate executive, with all the preparation from the private sector in terms of their leadership development. Very little leaning into the clinical capability that they had as and the therapeutic capability that they have as nurses, which clearly would have learned early on in their careers. So those that are successful somehow manage to hold that tension and to lead nursing and to have the identity of nurse alongside of being an executive nurse. And I'm arguing that actually all nurses would really benefit from understanding the culture in which they are steeped in, but also questioning and challenging, as you'll see in a few slides in a moment, the way that we actually prepare our nurses for leadership. So if we go on to the next slide, the so what of all of that is I've created a model of successful executive nurse leadership, which you can see I'm surrounded in the outer blue circle with the cultural context of nurseism. Now that can be mediated. That doesn't always impact on people. Depends on the nature of the board and the prejudices that they hold, as well as the capability of the individual executive nurse to be able to navigate that. But what they will have to do, all of them, is to establish personal credibility, and they do that through their visibility. And I don't just mean proximal, that you can be seen, but how they get visible, nursing visible within an organization. And they have the capability of using those relational skills, their therapeutic skills that they learned very early in their nursing career, to actually be able to navigate some of the political tensions and those complexities. And they were, without a doubt, valuing and recognizing and using their emotional work, even if they their emotional capability, even if they didn't name it as such. And one of the things that they were all able to do, and I've framed it as a rhetorical capability, is that they could tell the story, which we know is a characteristic of successful leadership, the ability to be persuasive, to be influential through the stories that you tell, depending on the audience to whom you are talking. In terms of framing that theoretically, I was brave. I still want to giggle when I think I might be audacious enough to think that my little doctoral study there could actually contribute to the seminal work of Carper. But I'm arguing that I'm going to be brave and hold that space, and that I believe that some of this work can help illuminate the way in which we know nursing knowledge, which is what Carper's Ways of Knowing course tells us, is about how do we understand what nursing actually is. That was extended by Jackson et al. In 2009, and I further extended their work through the way in which I'm articulating that we could come to understand the way in which nurses successfully lead and are perceived to be successfully leading. So if we go to the next slide, the kind of so what of that in terms of some of the recommendations, and there are many, but here is just a few. I want to invite us to embrace and leverage our relational leadership, the things that we were good at as nurses, the things that actually mark us out in our profession, and to recognize the emotional work carries on through those hybrid roles. It's not something that just happens in direct patient care, and that it's legitimate and it's valuable. and that we should think about this. We don't tend to talk about roles as being hybrid, but certainly if you are a ward manager, you are in a hybrid role, you're leading a clinical team, you might even be clinically active in terms of direct care, but you also have a managerial responsibility. And we don't talk about identity development, I think, enough, and I think that we should. Um, as I've said, I'm contending that we would want to synthesize that liminality, because I think the liminality that these successful executive nurses were able to hold is a strength and not a weakness, and that we should think about how we can support that and facilitate that through career progression. And that we should think about nursing leadership theory, that we should challenge whether productivity managerial theory from the private sector is actually the right type of theory to be informing our leadership development. And we need to think about how we could use that to change the narrative of nursing, because it's clear, as I showed you in that nurseism diagram, that actually the narrative that we have around nursing is not as strong as it needs to be. It's not as influential. It's not changing the perceptions of government. If you think about the pay negotiations that we're going through at the moment, the battle that had to take place in the new reorganisation of the NHS within England about getting executive nurses to the top table. And what we all need to do, and I would suggest this needs to start from being a student nurse, is learn to develop those rhetorical skills, those presentation skills, be able to tell the story of why and how nursing is making that difference, and how that is, but to do that in a way that is not leaning into the emotional script. So what am I doing about that? Well, I'm obviously advocating here and within my own work now. I now work as a senior lecturer with responsibility for a number of leadership programs. So I'm certainly tailoring my programs now for not just for nurses, but for the whole multidisciplinary group of people who come on that, to be talking about the tensions in a way that is healthy and productive, and also with work that I'm doing, and I'm going to show you a little bit about that on the next slide, how I've actually tried to, as you would expect with a professional doctorate, to take that back to a practice area and try and implement it. And that's what you can see on this slide. So the snazzy word that we use now is knowledge exchange. So I'm working really hard to think about how do I exchange my knowledge. So this doesn't just stay as my vanity project, as a legacy, which is what I set out. I thought I wanted to do, to kind of answer the question. I now feel reinvigorated to actually do something with that and get that into practice. And here are the things that I'm working on in order to be able to bring that knowledge exchange to fruition. So you need to maintain your networks, and you need to think about how you can expand those networks, and you need to think about your circle of influence, and how do you expand that circle of influence. Obviously, you can tell that I'm really keen that we shape the narrative, so I'm having to work harder how I think about my 2-minute pitch on shaping that narrative and influencing others. And one of the ways, and Elaine might be able to confirm this, I often will now pick out people, because you will often hear very senior nurses saying, my background as a nurse. Well, if you're there because of your nursing as an executive nurse, nursing is not your background, it is your foreground. And you will hear often your more direct caregivers to say, I'm just a nurse. There's nothing just about being a nurse. So if nothing else, those are 2 things that I use in my elevator pitch. Clearly, I've been to a number of conferences. My publications have been less than others. I've got one in print at the moment. I still need to do the big write-up, but I use a lot of my work with the Royal College of Nursing. I'm currently a member of the Council of council member for the Royal College of Nursing, but I've held other voluntary roles as well. And one of the things I used my work for was in the project to review and redraft the definition of nursing, and that's being used both in current pay negotiations as well as submitted evidence to the World Health Organization, not World Health, that was very grand, Sally, to actually the ICN on their publication last year on the new definition of nursing. And one of the things that I'm working hard on at the moment is I've been very fortunate to, through the networks, through the circles of influence, to become involved in a NHS England project to rewrite that nursing executive guidance. So my evidence from my study has found its way into that new guidance, and that's probably going to be published at the same time or just after on the new nursing strategy that Duncan Barton is leading. And I've been part of the project team that now have drafted the masterclasses for new executive nurses and helping to shape and inform the new leadership development program for our new ICB nurses, and there's going to be massive jobs, and I've been very fortunate to be able to be part of the initiation, or the first masterclass that both those two groups will go through. And as I've already said, I'm using my work within my own practice and even within the university, because I don't sit within nursing, but within the university, to try and be influential about how we approach leadership for the health and social care students that come along, and have set up a thinking critically community of practice, I guess we could possibly call it, in the way that we are now, and thinking differently about how we might invite students to engage on those programs. The complex diagram on the right is it's not complex. It's just a Gantt chart of all the things that I committed to doing. I wouldn't say that I'm hitting every time scale, but at least some part of my week every week is about trying to move forward with the exchange of knowledge and having working towards having an impact on practice. And thank you, Sophie, to the next slide. So
in conclusion, as we come to your time where we're going to be doing your Q&A, for people just to add, I see one person has added a question, but any more questions, and I'll be hosting those in just a second.
Brilliant. Okay, this is my last slide, so it means I almost managed the time. So as I've said, prior to this work, executive nurse leadership was atheoretical, so their praxis wasn't underpinned in any with any evidence. They're clearly working in a complex cultural, emotional, and structural dynamic environment, and that shapes the way in which they undertake their leadership. And as I've argued, valuing the capability and the executive contribution through liminality can inform not just executive nurse leadership development, but all of our leadership development. And that quote there is from one of our participants, who at the end of the interviews, I will always invite them to, is there something that you've just thought of, or that you were struck by now you've had an opportunity to tell your story? Is there something that you hadn't realized before until you told that story? And this is a quote from one of those participants, which for me kind of captures the whole of the study, which is, chief nurses are extraordinary people. They're doing an amazing job, particularly given the deficit position that they start from. And they hadn't realised that before now, which for me means that in respect of nursism, if we can call it out and start to shift the narrative, then maybe they won't be starting. Maybe all nurses won't be starting from the same deficit position as we do now. So thank you for your time. That was my study.
Thank you very much, Sally. And I think I just want to say what a wonderful presentation it is, and it gives us a real insight and window into the world of executive nurses and quite frankly, what they have to put up with, really, isn't it, as well, in achieving what they do for us, representing us at trust level and at board level. Yeah. And I think you implied it was a rather under-researched area, and that's how you came into it. And I was really inspired by your model that you produced at the end, that you say is, in some way moves on the work of Carper and Jackson. And I just wondered, how has that model been accepted? I mean, I know you said you haven't published yet. Is that your next thing, to publish that model? And what's the reaction to it?
So thank you, Kathleen. So the answer is, I haven't formally published. I have been to probably 8, 9 conferences to present it, and it has resonated with audience participants who are not just executive nurses, obviously, but from the whole fraternity of nursing, and it is resonating with them, particularly the concept of nurseism. And that when you explain it to people, they kind of go, oh yeah, yes, absolutely. We're just so socialized to accept it, and to not even think about it. But when you surface it for people, they kind of go, yes. So I was at a Leo Leadership Facilitators Day, for example, and there was not a single person in that room who didn't go, yeah, I get that. You must now talk about it, which makes me feel immensely guilty. But I haven't actually been able to sit down and write the necessary 8,000 word for something for an academic journal. But it is on my to-do list for this year. So conceptually, yes, it's accepted. No, I haven't published it as such yet.
Okie dokie, thank you very much. And I'm going to, we are running short of time, so I'm going to go to the Q&As that have been listed. So we have Amanda Keller would like to ask you this question. Do you think the higher social value that doctors have still exists? And do you think more research is needed on this? And second part, did your research highlight any ways this could be addressed?
Thank you, Amanda. So yes, I think the absolutely the higher status of medicine still exists. As I've said, I was filling in a survey myself just this week where doctors are considered have high professional value, and nurses are put into the junior professional status. So that absolutely still exists. Now, I'm not suggesting that doctors don't find it hard to lead, or doctors don't struggle with becoming good managers or becoming good executive directors. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the profession, the status of medicine in of itself, already has high social value out there in society, out there in our in the kind of the zeitgeist of the moment. And that's partly to do with history, partly to do with mail, partly to do with the way the entry gate is controlled. And it's an arduous program. Their structure is actually quite simple in terms of, when you graduate, the steps to actually get to a really senior career are really clearly laid out, and are structurally and I would say resource allocation to make that happen is clear and organized, and that is not how it is for executive nurses. What do we want to do about it? Well, I guess there's a real risk of us shouting into an echo chamber. As I said, it all resonated. So with any kind of social movement, you actually need to engage with a wide range of stakeholders. So on my to-do list is to think hard and more about engaging with our managerial class and our medical classes to think about how to change that. I mean, you might even be seeing it now and how it's being played out with the BMA and their really very aggressive and unpleasant attack on advanced nursing and advanced nurse practitioners. I would suggest that is an example of how we might our response to that, but how that's actually playing out in the public space is an example that it still exists.
Thank you very much for that very comprehensive answer to that. And so, as time is short, there aren't any more questions in the Q&A. Just congratulations on a nice talk.
Thank you.
I would now like to hand back to Helen, who's going to introduce our next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sally. That was such an interesting talk and so articulately presented. Thank you so much. In the next section, we had taken a slightly different tack, where we're asking both Sally and Elaine, who graduated from our doctoral programme a few years ago now, to talk about their reflections on the programme, in which they very innovatively wrote up and got published in the Journal of Advanced Nursing, which was a real success and a real attribute to all of their hard work on the programme. So I'd like to hand back to Sally and also to Elaine, who are going to talk about their reflections with reference to the paper that they published. Thank you.
Thank you. Helen. This was a paper that we completed during our doctorate, at the end of a doctorate. But first, an introduction from me. I am currently working as a chief nurse and director of quality in an ambulance service, I undertook the doctorate with Sally. We were the first cohort, a cohort of 8 experienced nurses from various different sectors of nursing that were the first cohort of professional doctorate at this particular university. And I was thrilled to be part of that. But we started to think about some interesting facts about our doctorate. We know that many doctoral programs have a high attrition rate, and we were struck by the fact that 9 of us started, but within 3 months there were 8 of us, and all 8 of us then completed our doctoral journey. And we were struck by what made that happen. So we started to think about what was that about? Why might that have happened? We first got together to look at our journey using our use of a WhatsApp group that we started at the very beginning to actually just keep us in touch with who's meeting where and what room are we in, that became a really strong forum for us discussing things. And we started to look at that. And then towards the end of our programme, we decided to get together and actually think about explain why we stayed. We were curious about what was it about our cohort, and what I'm going to do is just share a few thoughts on what we found. And we did actually write it up. And so although Sally was saying she hasn't published, actually she was instrumental in writing this paper. And the questions we asked ourselves are really, actually, why did we stay? Now we used, and if you thought about leaving, why? And how do you make sense of the fact that we all as a group successfully completed it? The programme. We started using the principles of autoethnography. So we started with individual reflections in response to those questions. We read each other's reflections, met to discuss them, code them as a collective, and then we recorded our discussion, which that helped us develop our understanding. And then all group members contributed to that both discussion. We even got permission from the person who wasn't able to complete, who left within 3 months, of actually using the original data. But that became less important than actually the conversations amongst ourselves. So we then actually met, we looked at the recording, and then we started to draw out, well, ideas or themes. So I'm going to take us through probably the first 2 questions, which were, why did we stay? And what sense of it do we make? And we found a couple of reasons for staying. The first was about commitment, and that had really 3 strands. One was proving, second was obligation and self-determination. I'll briefly explain those in a moment. And then actually we recognised there was a really strong sense of shared identity and common humanity amongst us as a group. So just taking the first bit about commitment, we recognised that actually we had all considered leaving the programme at some point or other during the programme. And that was due to things like stresses in our personal lives, professional lives, or indeed COVID. We went through COVID while we were on the programme, and that significantly impacted on our professional lives. Some of our cohort were frontline, others, like myself, setting up a Nightingale. So that process and those stressors, we thought that actually strengthened our commitment. And the first thing we talked about was proving. So we all felt an impetus to prove to ourselves or others that we had the intellectual ability and staying power to complete the programme. And perhaps there's an alignment with Sally's research there about where nursing has a standing. We wanted to prove that we could complete something and that we actually had the intellectual ability to do that. There was also a real fear of failure that we recognised as we talked that underpinned a lot of our thinking. For myself, owning my own comment, I was fearful that if I did fail, I'd just be an attrition number. No one much would care that I was just one of these people that just didn't finish it. So that fear of failure drove us to actually prove ourselves and commit to the programme. There was also a sense of obligation. We recognised that others had supported us and to do the programme. Some of us were funded. Others that weren't funded were very committed to wanting to realise the program because of the time commitment on our families. And we felt a real strong commitment actually to our tutors. This program was the first of its kind in this particular university, and therefore we recognised there was a lot invested for our tutors, and we had great tutors. So there was a real obligation, we felt, to actually realise that dedication and commitment of the teaching team and our supervisors. And then lastly, I think that sense of obligation was to the group. As we carried on, some people said, well, if I stop now, it will affect the whole group. We realised we'd become a group together, and whatever one of us did would affect the others. The self-determining was really driven by a need to improve ourselves and a sense of that obligation, but it fueled us determination. We wanted to contribute to nursing, to research, and we wanted to actually be doctors of nursing and to hold our own in terms of some of the things that needed to happen in health. So that was a shared belief that we actually, if we commit to something, we then see it through. And then we noticed that actually that commitment, that was a sense of shared identity amongst us and almost common humanity. So we saw that as being quite motivating. We recognised that there must have been something about the selection of us as a group of cohort. There was a significant investment for academic staff. The programmes are on Saturday, so it means coming in. And there was a group support. So somebody said, actually, I felt our group was important, not just for me personally or for our profession, for the university and the lectures. So we felt invested in our identity as forerunners. We recognised we had a strong desire to be successful and make an impact as a cohort, which is probably why we wrote the paper. But there was also something that we absolutely loved, the nurturing nature of the group. So food often, our conversations often around food. We quickly had a coffee, kettle and food baking rota. Actually, I can't say it's a rota. Other people baked brilliantly for us throughout the programme. But we would eat and drink together even through COVID in our separate houses. So actually that nurturing nature of our group was important. And I think that sort of added to the shared humanity. Reflecting on WhatsApp, we said that probably wasn't the WhatsApp was the cause, but it was what kept us together. It was the medium of connection. And as we continued, being part of that doctoral cohort became really important to us. And actually, one person said, when I finished the programme, what I felt was relief. But when the whole group finished, I felt absolute joy. And I think that showed something about how we'd come together a group. And we reflected on whether we called each other a sisterhood. We were all female, we were all nurses, we all wanted to have a powerful and sustained connection. And indeed, we've kept that. So that's probably the first insights of why we think that the group continued and why we stayed. We did go back and look at the literature and found it really quite affirming because actually it validated the things that we'd come up with independently. But I'm going to just move now on to Sally, who's going to talk a bit about how we made sense of our cohort experience of completion.
Thank you, Elaine. So there is, I guess, kind of an overlap in answering the question, making sense of it, in what Elaine has already said. So what I would add to the points that she's already made around common identity and that shared sense of identity is that something emerged organically, as Elaine said, from the kind of quite functional set of exchanges that we had on the WhatsApp group, and it was completely spontaneous. And in setting that up, I'd never been on a WhatsApp group before, so this was one of my first. And it evolved over time. It was quite as I said, organic. But what became clear is that identity was not about us as individuals or just us as a group of students. It became as something else, and it was that emergent growth of identity, and the sense of being part of Oxford Brookes, that created an understanding and a cohesion between us that was really hard to explain to anybody else outside of that. The support that we got from within that group, we thought might have been something to do with the fact that we were the first group, and wondered about the selection process that the lecturers might have gone through to choose us. We might have been that pent up group really looking for this as as something to do. So maybe our need was particularly strong. But one of the things that definitely came out of that was a sense of responsibility. So one of the explanations that we had is that without any negotiation, without any discussion, this emergent sense of responsibility towards each other, and a responsibility for the investment that we'd have from our tutors and supervisors. Where that led to, as Elaine's alluded to, is this desire for collective success. When we've looked at the literature, when we've gone back and looked at the literature, as similar to a kind of a grounded theory approach, is that we had developed all the aspects and characteristics of becoming a community of practice. And a community of practice is very much one of a peer, whether you've got that shared focus and that shared desire and intent, but there's no competition. So what was interesting for us, I think, looking back as an explanation, where we might have felt competitive or the need to prove to others around us outside of in our day jobs and to ourselves, what we didn't have to do was to prove to each other. And I think it's fair to say that one of the explanations that we felt very comfortable at settling on was this working in this really unique space of non-competitive support, where actually it was the collective success at the end that was important, not just the individual. Elaine has also talked about the joy. One of the explanations around the joy was not just the physical, and some people could really bake very nice rhubarb cake. And it wasn't just the emotional support, but the joy of learning together professionally about nursing. I think many of us felt that were doing our nursing jobs without ever having had an opportunity to step back and think about nursing. So this unraveling of the complexities of nursing and this knowledge growth, so we had a deep understanding of nursing in a way that we had never seen it before or viewed it before, that actually in a way kind of brought to life the earlier modules that we had done. For example, a couple of modules were called Concepts of Nursing. We'd answered that module from our previous job experiences, and many of us said it would just be so nice to go back now and actually do that module again, because our understanding of nursing is so different to what it was before. And again, if you look at the literature, that professional growth and that shared body of knowledge that you're producing is one of the things that brings joy. So it wasn't just our cohort was experiencing this, that happens to other groups of nurses who come together and have the opportunity to dwell, to think without any guilt that that's how you're spending your time, thinking about nursing. And nearly all of us said, in fact, nearly all of us did, in fact, we all did say, if only we had done this earlier in our careers, what better nurses might we have been? How better might we have been at our jobs of being able to explain what nursing is? So we had this growth of professional friendship. One of the things that came out from the reflection and the analysis, that we may never have chosen to be friends in any kind of social setting or even at work. That we were completely different characters, but there was a professional growth. And again, when we examined what we were doing, that we realized that we were demonstrating Socratic questioning in this very non-competitive environment, which actually, if you take it back and think about your code of conduct, one of the things that you have a kind of a moral duty obligation to do is to develop nursing and to support others around you. And we had slipped into that with each other without, again, as I said, that kind of conscious negotiation of setting up a contract between each other. But we would, on WhatsApp and face-to-face, say, well, I'm thinking about this particular model. what's the word I'm looking for? This is what's happening. What do you think this word is? And then you'd all sort of pile in to kind of have that conversation around what it was that we think that we were exploring. So for me, for example, I was asking about before I'd come up with nurses, I said, what do you call privilege? When somebody else has got something that you haven't and you're disadvantaged. So you were able to have professional Socratic questions, and it was that brought about the love and the joy of thinking about nursing and just being with somebody else who was not time bound to think with you. Um, uh, and what we realized at the end of writing our reflective piece, and we were really quite disciplined and rigorous about how we went about that, is that we were engaging in that kind of metacognition, that meta reflexivity, that when we finished and be able to step back and say, oh, do you know what? I think what we've just done is it brought closure to this experience of working together. And that we are no longer now professional doctoral students. We're now doctors of nursing. And although the university and big thanks to Helen for making it happen, we were able on our day of graduation to have a kind of a get together with some of the stakeholders and to share with the chief nurses in our local area the work that we had undertaken. It was actually us coming together and to do that final piece of reflexivity about making sense and bringing it to a closure that enabled us to transition into and not giggle quite so hard at now being called Dr. Sally or being called Dr. Elaine, that we now owned this new identity. So what would we say to others about this? One of the things that is possibly distinct, well, is definitely distinctive about a professional doctorate compared to a PhD, is although the literature talks about it, this type of study being very lonely, we were never lonely. It was a lone endeavor, and we had to do our individual struggles and midnight oil and getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning to write the papers, but we were never alone. So the face-to-face element of that is something that we thought was absolutely critical. If it hadn't had that face-to-face piece, we felt that this might not have happened. Even though when you move into the research part of it, there's no necessary real reason for you to come together because you're on your lone journey. We actually engineered time to come together. So that face-to-face and the WhatsApp in particular meant that we were never alone in this journey. The whole process of the reflexivity, as I said, brought closure. And the things that we said that we would recommend to others is, it's obvious, isn't it? But love your topic because you're going to be with it for a very, very long time. So the real deep interest in the question that you might have felt to be really, really important. And that community of practice literature might be useful for people to look at as they start on this. And obviously that was a recommendation that we've also made to our tutors and suggested in the paper that they, not just our tutors, but any other academics who are running programs like this might want to think about how do they facilitate that end growth piece, that moving beyond the graduation to kind of bring student identity to an end and the start of a being a doctor of nursing journey with whatever it is that you're going to be moving on to in terms of your knowledge exchange. So that was our experience.
Yes,
Very
that's
obviously
amazing.
for people to ask questions.
Yes, we will be encouraging more people to ask questions. Please put them in the Q&A. So I wanted to say what wonderful advocates and alumni of the programme that you both are. And it's been so great to hear and to see how, and just to have it illuminated how this community of practice grew. And I've written lots of bullet point words down here as you said them, about the relief and the joy that Elaine mentioned, the sense of responsibility towards others, and about, I think the really important one to pick out as well is Socratic questioning. The way you end up there, Sally, by saying, again, something I've written down, alone endeavour but not alone, I think that almost needs to be a quote representing the whole programme. And I myself have experience of doing a professional doctorate, and so I could really see the comparisons of my own experience that I had. And I think it is your paper really does give an answer, if you like, when people ask the question, as Helen and I get a lot of the time, what's the difference between doing a PhD and a professional doctorate? And this in some way answers half of the question about, there are other sort of maybe academic questions that might want to be answered there, but for me it was always about having that community of practice that I've really enjoyed, and I felt that coming out of from you two today. Elaine, you've want to say add something in here?
Yes, just to add that I'm one of the people that in Sally's study would say, I wish I'd done this doctorate many years ago. So, but for me, it felt like nectar to learn about nursing, to be able to think about nursing, and to do something that we thought could actually shape nursing for the future. So I wouldn't have missed it. Just wish I'd done it earlier.
I think we all say that actually. Yes, Sally.
Just to add, Kathleen, as well, although obviously Elaine and I are here today, this paper was written by all of us, and everybody was a contributor. And again, I think that's probably a testament to the experience. Not everybody had a massive, not everybody said it was universally amazing. There were definitely challenges and absolute bumps. And disagreements along the way, not necessarily well, definitely not with each other, but with the process and some of the doctoral experiences. So I wouldn't want to give an artificial glow about how wonderful it was, because it was hard and difficult, and the problems needed to be solved. But I think the group enabled those that venting and letting off of emotion was done in a really very healthy way. But I absolutely want to attribute and thank everybody in our cohort who contributed to that paper.
Lovely, thank you so much. I'm going to hand back now to Helen as the programme lead for the Prof Doc for our final concluding remarks.
Oh, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Sally, Elaine, and Kathleen. Thanks for such a wonderful and really thought-provoking presentation. We are at time. If anybody does have any more questions, email me, drop me an email, and I can forward them on. That's no problem at all. And also to flag up that if you'd like to find out more about our doctorate, then Sophie's kindly put the link to our promotional video on the chat there. So please do use that as well. And thank you everybody for coming along today. Thank you.